Washington, D.C.
Breaking news tonight, President Trump says Canada is to blame as poor air quality from wildfire smoke impacts millions in the U.S., including the nation's capital. Trump now demanding Canada pay for what he calls willful negligence. Also, a new flashpoint in the war with Iran, reports of bridges and energy sites being struck as the escalating conflict puts new upward pressure on oil prices. And Mexico's new ambassador to the U.S. sits down with balance of power for his first U.S. TV interview. His thoughts on the future of U.S.-Mexico trade talks, ICE enforcement, drug cartels, and the World Cup. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
And Kaylee, we begin with President Trump indeed declaring blame Canada. The president, who just departed Washington on Marine One, flying through a thick cloud of smoke from wildfires up north, says, yes, Canada has shown, quote, willful negligence, unquote, for how it has maintained its forests and containment of the wildfires, suggesting they could be hit with additional tariffs. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, this is what it looks like in the nation's capital, a lot like New York has from earlier this week. You can barely see the Capitol Dome from our bureau in downtown Washington. And with us here in our bureau for more is Bloomberg's Laura Davison. I don't know if you wore a mask on your way in, but you wouldn't have been the only one, Laura. What do we make of this? A story that all of us seem to share here in the Amtrak corridor, now Canada's fault.
Yes, this is certainly what the president came out and said on True Social. The timing is a little auspicious here. Today was really the first day that the smoke really showed up in Washington.
Yeah.
And of course, this is just days ahead of the World Cup finals, this event that Trump has been excited for years. It's sort of a big, a set piece on the world stage,
Absolutely.
literally. And the visuals may not look that great. And that's, of course, something that's very important to the president. So we see him saying he's going to call Mark Carney of Canada, ask him to take blame. And he also threatened some tariffs. It's not clear that he has any teeth there, given his limited tariff powers. But this is something that is forefront of the president's mind as he was flying to New Jersey through that cloud of smoke.
Well, of course, that's what the president is up to today. Yesterday was a very different story as he had a primetime address in the Oval Office addressing the nation about election integrity and ever so briefly touching on Iran, which seems to be heating up and re-escalating, widening as we speak, Laura.
Yeah, so this is really sort of a speech that kind of went, in with a like a lion and out like a lamb. People were really hoping to hear about Iran. We now are in 6 or 7 days of tit-for-tat attacks. The administration or the U.S. is going after energy sites, bridge sites, really sort of escalating some of these. Oil is up now at $88 a barrel. This appears to be sort of on a track, and the president doesn't seem inclined at all to pull back here. Yeah. He said that, he's been, very critical of the Iranian regime and says he doesn't necessarily want to negotiate, wants Iran to come to the table and just sort of capitulate. Unlikely that that's going to happen. But this was all, in a speech where he was really focused on election security. And that tells you where the president's mind is. He's not necessarily as focused on this war, but focused on some grievances from 6 years ago.
Well, just to be clear, he referred to a lot of raw intelligence last evening and suggested there might be more evidence rather than raw intelligence, I should say, to come. Have we heard anything else from the White House to back up some of these claims about China?
We really haven't. They released some documents, but these were either things that had been previously released or were sort of out there in the narrative already and didn't really shed any new light. But this is, a very interesting moment for this. This is, as Xi is planning to come or potentially planning to come to the U.S. for a couple more sit-downs with the president over the next couple months before the end of the year. But this could really call this into question. We're seeing some sorts of concessions. The U.S., today also did some relief for Hong Kong. So there's, a couple different pieces moving here, but it's going to potentially be a wrench in U.S.-China relations.
Wow.
All right. Bloomberg's Laura Davison, thank you so much for joining us. And joining us now for more on the president's speech and other issues is Democratic Congressman Joe Morelle of New York, the ranking member of the House Administration Committee and vice-ranking member on the House Appropriations Committee. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg. I'm looking at a statement that you put out in which you called the president's speech last night pathetic and unserious. You call it pretext to undermine the results in November by casting false doubt on the integrity of our democratic systems. Is there no merit to any claim that there may be vulnerabilities in America's voting systems?
Well, look, there are certainly vulnerabilities. There are foreign adversaries who would like to attack our elections. That's why I'm dismayed that the president himself dismantled the election security unit at CISA, our cybersecurity agency. But having a vulnerability and having them exploited are two different things. And the president last night quoted from old intelligence reports that have been made available but his own intelligence agencies in 2020 concluded that there was no credible evidence that any of this had actually resulted in any of the claims he's made. So it's already been discounted. The president continues to do this partly because he simply can't get over the fact that he lost the 2020 election. And I think there's an immaturity in him that he's never going to get past it. But more importantly, this is a concerted effort by the president, as he has done when he talks about the SAVE Act, when he talks about all manner of things, executive orders, as a pretext to trying to undermine the verdict of the people in the 2026 midterm elections. So, we're very concerned about his wild accusations, unfounded charges. It's what he does. And he lies, and his administration members swear to it. But there is no credible evidence. It didn't happen. The vulnerabilities would be and should be met by election security unit in CISA and in other parts of the government. But he's dismantled all of that. So we're concerned, but we're continuing to move ahead. And Americans should know, look, American elections are safe. They're secure. People should have confidence. Local election administrators, and I talk to them all over this country, Democrats and Republicans, do a great job. They're very, very serious about their work. They take it almost as a sacred obligation because they know the American people rely on them to be able to render a verdict when it comes to election time.
Well, it certainly did not seem, Congressman, to be a presentation that would bring Democrats and Republicans closer together. And you can speak to the discord on Capitol Hill. A lot of folks think we're in a world in which nothing gets passed for the rest of this midterm election cycle. But the Speaker of the House has presented a continuing resolution to kind of jump past the expiration of government funding at the end of September and clear Election Day. Is that something that Democrats are open to, or are we bracing for a shutdown at the end of September?
No, look, Joe, the problem is we continue to do this. We kick the can down the road. We try to pass elections so that there's no ability to have an accounting. We need to work on appropriation bills. I'm on the Appropriation Committee. We have reported all 12 of the bills that need to be considered. We should be passing them in the House. We should continue to move ahead. And we shouldn't start. Here we are in the middle of July, and the Speaker wants to wave the white flag and say, we surrender. We can't possibly conclude our work by October 1st. I mean, it is the height of irresponsibility. And look, I get it. They're very concerned about the midterm elections. They're concerned about the poll numbers for the president, on the economy, on Iran, on the cost of living. I understand it. But you know what they should do? They should work on fixing what they're doing in terms of policy, not simply trying to go around the American people so that they're left with no real information as they cast ballots in November.
So understood, Congressman, that you would like to see the regular appropriations process completed by the end of the fiscal year. But if we were to arrive at September 30th, and it is not, and a continuing resolution is the only option to keep the government open, are your colleagues willing to do a CR just ahead of the midterms in that scenario?
Well, look, it's a long ways away, but what often happens is it's described as a simple continuing resolution. We're going to take funding from last year, carry it forward. But unfortunately, that's not what ever happens. They always add additional things that weren't part of the original deal. And a CR also gives inordinate amounts of power to the Office of Management and Budget that controls budget. Russ Vought already ignores Congress. This will just give him greater license to do it. So I think it will depend, Kayleigh, on what's actually in it. And I hate to say it, but we would have to verify what is the claims about it. But I think, again, to start having that conversation in the middle of July, we're months away. Why aren't we just working hard at trying to get an agreement between the Senate and the House, send it to the president for his signature? It says to me the height of irresponsibility that in July we're talking about things that essentially shouldn't happen for a couple of months when we consider a CR. Why would you do it now when there's so much time and the American people are counting on a government that meets its minimum obligations, which is to have an appropriation package so we can have government spending that has been vetted by representatives in the House, representatives in the Senate, and sent to the president for his action.
Well, we can probably all agree that what should be debated right now is this supplemental budget request that the White House has made to pay for the war in Iraq, not to mention the $1.5 trillion Pentagon funding request that would be part of the annual budget allocation. I'm just curious your thoughts on the supplemental here. This number's grown to $95 billion. It's not all for Iran, of course. You've got money for farmers, money, in fact, for election security. But with the president upping the ante here and promising next week to start attacking power plants, we saw reportedly 6 bridges go down in the last 24 hours. Congressman, what do you need to hear from this administration, if not an actual argument from the president himself, as some of the war powers questions have brought up, to vote for that?
Well, it's a great question, Joe. We have the power of the purse. The founders put that in Article 1 of the United States Constitution. We have been asking literally for months now of the administration for financial accounting of what's been spent in Iran so far in this effort. I said to Secretary Hegseth when he appeared in front of our committee months ago that General Washington got information faster to the Continental Congress in 1776 than we're getting right now about the unauthorized war in Iran. So I don't see how we vote on a supplemental when we haven't been given basic information about what the cost has been, nor have we gotten any idea on what the president's goals are. Look, he says one thing one day, changes completely his story the next day. He's really not credible any longer on this question, but we need an accounting, and I suspect that a lot of voices in Congress, both on the Democratic and Republican side, are going to demand an accounting of what's happened up till now before we even get into a serious conversation about a supplemental. And I would certainly ask for it. I hope my colleagues ask for that same accounting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, from accounting to accountability, Congressman, the president says he's holding Canada accountable for the wildfire smoke that has blanketed so much of the country in the mid-Atlantic. I'm sure you're feeling that in Rochester, where I know you've had air quality concerns, just like New York City has. Should Canada shoulder some of the blame for the after effects, the pollution that have stemmed from wildfires?
Well, first of all, I got off the plane last night from Washington. I was astonished at just, you take a deep breath. I'm sure you're feeling it now in Washington. I can see from the pictures there you're getting it. But look, the president has ignored the real crisis of the climate. He continues to be a denier. He continues to cast doubt on science that's been proven over and over again by experts worldwide. So, and he's also delayed our ability to respond to emergency situations because of what he's done to FEMA. So, look, should we engage in a conversation with Canada? Should we be offering help to put the wildfires out? Should we be engaged in a more fruitful conversation with our neighbors to the north? Absolutely. But, this is the kind of unserious things that the president does. Why doesn't he pick up the phone and talk to the prime minister and say, how does the United States help with dealing with this, not only for the benefit of Americans, but for the benefit of Canadians and people around the world as we deal with the dire effects of this climate crisis, which the president continues to put his head in the sand and ignore. And we see it. You're seeing it. We've seen it the last several days. It's real, and it's here.
Yeah. It sure is. Take a deep breath, Congressman. It's good to have you with us. Good luck getting out of the smoke. Democratic Congressman Joe Morelle from New York, we thank you. As we turn to Wall Street, markets kept a wary eye on the Strait of Hormuz today as we're talking Iran here, with crude oil prices rising once again. Brent up over 4% to near $88 a barrel. Stock indexes finished in the red as semiconductors led the way lower, pulling the overall chip sector into bear market territory. We've come a long way. It was thanks in part to another DeepSeek moment from China, with startup Moonshot AI unveiling its new model that is more capable, they say, than leading models from the likes of Anthropic and OpenAI. For more, we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who's live at World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Nora.
Well, a really interesting week on Wall Street. So we didn't really see any crazy interesting size and scope as you look on a weekly basis, but we did see the Russell 2000 seeing its second straight week of declines. If we take a look at Friday, though, we saw the S&P 500 lower by about 1%. The tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 lower by 1.5%. And that really pressured by those chip makers that you just called out there, Joe. So we did see, of course, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index pushing into a bear market. Now, that is a 20 20% slide from its recent late June high that we saw there. But there was a lot going on this week, really, of course, capping it off here with China's moonshot AI model, really seeing a breakthrough, and that really begging the question for a lot of investors here on Wall Street as to whether or not we're seeing a second DeepSeek moment, maybe a DeepSeek 2.0. But it was a really long week. We started out kicking things off strong with some really solid bank earnings, and then we got some cooler than expected inflation data, really begging the question as to whether or not we can keep hope in the fact that the Fed can stay on hold. But in the background, of course, we also have a lot of eyes on the Middle East, given the fact that we've been seeing these geopolitical tensions still in focus. So we did see oil surging. If you take a look at Brent crude, it's hanging around $88 a barrel, WTI hanging around $82 a barrel there. But both of them surging as we're continuing to keep a pulse on what's going on between the U.S. and Iran. But a lot really happening this week, although we didn't see too much of a sizable size and scope on the week. We certainly saw a lot of action over the past 5 days.
All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda watching the markets for us. Thank you so much. And I want to bring your attention to some breaking news. A Bloomberg scoop just crossing the terminal that the Trump administration is considering creating a new regulator to vet the safety of artificial intelligence models with input from the industry. According to our reporting, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent helped develop this proposal, which would create an independent regulatory agency for AI that would report to the SEC, similar to Finra. And this is seen as essentially addressing some of the concern from Silicon Valley about the ad hoc nature of recent U.S. moves to slow the rollout of some of these AI models. Again, the U.S. is considering creating a Finra-like watchdog to vet new AI models. And we'll have more on that story with Bloomberg's Michael Shepard coming up later in the program. But first, the Cook Political Report is shifting its ratings on half a dozen House seats to the left as the midterms approach. We'll have the details up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The cover-up of this colossal security breach is even more disturbing in light of the additional information showing that China engaged in other election-related activities to undermine my first administration and our 2020 campaign. They did not want, and they just didn't want it. They fought like hell not to have it, Donald Trump, to win.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And that was President Trump last night accusing China of meddling in the 2020 election, an accusation that China's government denies. The president also used his remarks to call for the passage of the Save America Act, voter ID and proof of citizenship legislation he wants enacted ahead of this year's midterms, which are expected to be tough for Republicans, especially in the House. And a new analysis from the nonpartisan Cook Political Report is now shifting 6 House races more to the left. And joining us now for more on that is Erin Covey, editor of the House of Representatives for the Cook Political Report. Erin, welcome back to Bloomberg. Obviously, some of these races you still have as likely or leaning Republican, but the trend here is that they all moved leftward. And I wonder if that's for idiosyncratic reasons that are unique to each seat, or if more broadly this is telling us something about the direction of travel here in terms of sentiment ahead of November.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. So with these new ratings, they all reflect individual developments in each of these districts. Obviously, overall, the national environment does favor Democrats, and we expect them to be the clear favorites to win control of the House this year. The Republicans do still have a path, but all of these individual race rating shifts, they evolve as the cycle goes on and as we get more information about who the candidates are in these races, how much money they're raising, and polling information, which has really just started in earnest this summer.
What'll this mean about the money race, Erin? It's great to have you back. We hear so much about Republicans outraising Democrats, but it's not changing the trajectory based on your research.
That's a good question. So Republicans certainly do have a cash advantage at the party committee level and at the super PAC level. That will be a big help for them in November and will help Republicans defend the myriad of competitive House seats that they're defending. But at the candidate level, actually, Democrats have been outraising Republicans in the second quarter of this cycle. We saw that the majority of the Republican incumbents who are sitting in toss-up or lean Republican races were in fact outraised by their Democratic challengers. So I do think that in terms of money, yes, Republicans do have an advantage on the party committee side and on the super PAC side, but at the individual candidate level, Democrats are largely outraising Republicans at this point.
Well, and when we consider the map where that money is mostly going to be spent, Erin, it's not all decided yet. We know that at the party level, the DCCC has actually gotten involved in some primaries trying to boost their preferred candidates. There's a few races where we can point to in primaries that haven't happened yet. And I wonder what you make of that. And if you do see the establishment-backed candidates as having an advantage or disadvantage for that very reason.
It's a good question. It really varies district by district. Overall, one challenge that Democrats have had this cycle in these House races is that in a lot of the primaries in the most competitive districts, they are quite competitive, and you have progressives who are running in a lot of these places who may be just a bit too far left for some of these purple districts. Now, in terms of the primaries that we've seen so far, however, the establishment-backed candidates have been successful in a majority of those races. There have been a couple of high-profile and notable failures where the DTRIP-backed candidate did not win the Democratic Party nomination. But for the most part, I would say the establishment has been fairly successful, and we've largely seen center-left candidates coming out of these primaries.
Erin, I don't know if you stayed up for the president last evening, but he was talking about elections, which you specialize in, and casting doubt, of course, on election security, accusing China of meddling in our elections. This has been a continuation of rhetoric from this president for many years, of course. And I'm just wondering if there's an impact that's discernible on the voter, if not more than turnout, when you look at races like these, the president casting doubt on Americans' ability to trust the results of their elections creates what problem?
Yeah, it's a good question. Certainly we've seen in the past, back in 2020, the Georgia runoff elections, Republican turnout there was certainly dampened by the fact that Trump was casting doubt on the security of those elections that cycle. I don't know if I have seen much of an impact yet in terms of turnout in the House races so far this cycle. Overall, Democratic enthusiasm is much higher than Republican enthusiasm. And we've just seen that in polling in special election results so far. And that's as what we would expect in a midterm cycle. The party that's out of power, their voters are going to be a lot more motivated to turn out because they're the ones that are motivated to put a check on the party that's in control of Washington. So Republicans are trying to find ways to juice turnout. They have largely done that by embracing Trump and embracing his endorsement in all of these places. However, it's complicated in some of the less red districts. You don't just need to turn out your base. You also need to persuade a certain number of independents and maybe even some Democrats to win re-election. So it's a difficult line for all these Republican incumbents to walk.
We have less than a minute left, Erin, but if Republicans are able to retain the House in November, will it basically just be because of redistricting?
In large part, yes, I think that is fair to say. Republicans technically have a 3-seat majority right now, but due to redistricting, they have effectively given themselves an 8 or 9 seat cushion. And so if they are able to hold on to the House, they can thank the redistricting that happened over the past cycle. 10 states redrew their lines. Some were Republican, some were Democratic, some were as a result of court cases. But this was largely spurred by Trump's initial pressure that he put on Texas and North Carolina and Missouri lawmakers to redraw their maps, which they did.
Erin, it's great to have you back. Erin Covey, thank you so much. Coming up on Balance of Power, a massive 7.3 earthquake rocks the coast off of southwest Mexico. We're going to talk with Mexico's new ambassador to the U.S. on that, trade, and much more ahead. Only on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Mexico's new ambassador to the U.S. has just been elevated to the critical diplomatic post just as negotiators prepare for their next round of talks on a possible renewal of the USMCA set for next week. Roberto Lazzeri, who helmed two of Mexico's biggest development banks, sat down with us today for his first U.S. broadcast interview to talk about the negotiations, U.S. immigration enforcement, and the crackdown on Mexican cartels. But we started by asking him about a massive earthquake off the coast of southwestern Mexico earlier today. Listen.
Yes, the president reported that at this point we have no reports of damages. There was a tsunami alert, so we asked people to be aware of that. But it seems like it was not a very bad event.
Well, we're glad to hear that. We'd also like to talk about your experience, not in Mexico, but here in the U.S. over the last several weeks. You're obviously new to this role, and I wonder how you are thinking about the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Mexico and areas in which you would like to see it improve, how you plan to do so.
Yeah, I've been coming here for a while now. I used to work Ministry of Finance with a relation with the Treasury. So I see it like that. It's an everyday relationship along a lot of fronts. Every agency is talking to every other agency. I see a lot of institutionalization in our relationship. We aim to have protocols, frameworks, and have specific results and KPIs that we want to achieve. Mm-hmm. So this is the most important relationship in the world. We are the strongest partnership. So we see it like that. We see it as a relationship that we have to work constantly, but that it's very strong, and together we can achieve great things.
Some might suggest one of the most important things to achieve is a renewal of the USMCA, which I know is something that you have strong feelings about. This president didn't want to renew at the last stop on the 1st of July, so we're now in this rolling series of negotiations. I know there's an important meeting next week. Do you expect progress, or are we in this new world where we just reset the clock every year?
As progress is constantly done, there's been more than a year of work with the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. This relationship cannot be looked at just trade. It's a co-production relationship. It's a fine piece of architecture, the USMCA agreement, and it has President Trump's signature. At the end, we're discussing very much details. We are up to the point that 10 years after the initial signature, a lot of things have changed in the world. There's a lot of different conversations in terms of geopolitical shifts, mm-hmm. but also products have changed themselves. So it's a good time. The renewal opens up the opportunity to discuss very specific aspects of how are we going to set up the incentives so more production is done here in Mexico and the U.S. as well. We have our own internal industrialization plan called Plan Mexico. Uh-huh. It's very much along the lines of what we want to see: import substitution, additional manufacturing, and jobs in our region.
Well, as you talk about manufacturing and jobs, are you concerned that a lack of understanding as to what ultimately this trade agreement, whether it's bilateral or trilateral, will look like, is going to delay investment decisions companies might make?
It's one point that we have raised, that we need to give investors certainty. And I think every company that wants to invest in the region needs more than 1 year horizon for their business plan. I think our counterparts are very sensitive to that. We strongly believe that the three of us make all the sense in the world. We have together, we contribute each other with a lot of competitiveness, natural resources, and technology and innovation. So the aim is also to have something done very quick so that we can give certainty to all the investments that we want to achieve if we want to bring some of this manufacturing back.
Have you considered the prospect of this maybe taking 2 years or maybe a little more for the next administration to manage this?
The baseline for us is that we have a 10-year agreement. Yeah. And yes, this may take some time. We expect that it's done this year. I believe that the momentum expectation of our counterparts is that also is being done during this year. Okay. Every moment that we're losing, I think we're losing competitiveness, market share, and investment. So it's in the best interest of all the three of us to get to a position of resolution soon.
Well, as Joe alludes to, the next administration, it is still the Trump administration for the time being, and something that has come with that, obviously, is a crackdown on immigration and a deportation effort in the United States. Your government just this week requested that attorneys general in the United States look into the deaths that have happened in ICE custody of immigrants. Is that acting as an additional strain, point of tension on this relationship? Does it make your job more difficult?
This week, actually, we had very good meetings with our counterparts in the HS and the IC. At the end, I think we all want to take care of lives. We're not meddling into internal politics. We know they have a migration policy, and we respect that. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a goal in the best interest of both of the countries to have respect of the human rights and life of people. So at the end, yeah, that's what we wanted to achieve. I think we had very good conversations. It follows the same line. We need protocols. We need oversight. We need to have clear objectives of how we want to do things. And ultimately, what we want is to not have one life lost in this operations.
You could argue the U.S. is trying to meddle in Mexican politics by way of its war against the cartels, adding two more just in the last couple of days, Juarez and Los Viagras. That's on top of 6 others. You know, the president has mused openly about attacking them, about bombing the cartels inside the bounds of your sovereign nation. Is that something you're prepared for after what you've seen in Venezuela and to a lesser extent Cuba?
Yeah, we actually we're working very closely with the U.S. government. Yeah. All the last operations that we have done and taking big kingpins and a historical high in terms of seizures of fentanyl and pills and precursors. Mm-hmm. It's been done with a lot of cooperation. So
is that just bluster then? Is that a different conversation than the president's having with you?
The conversations that we have on a daily basis with our counterparts is just cooperation. And honestly, I don't think anyone has a better view of how to solve Mexico problems and how to achieve these operations and achieve actual results that we do and our security forces do. So at the end, that's the aim for us. The aim is to keep the eye in the ball. The eye in the ball is let's aim for this together. We have this concept that is called shared but a differentiated responsibility. And I think if you look at the fentanyl data or the deaths that was just published by the drug office in the White House, a decrease of 22%, it's a show of that. Mm-hmm. They did their part in education, access to Naloxone. We're doing our part in not allowing the drugs to cross the border. Those are the results. So we need to keep this path if we want to achieve great things together.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talk about keeping an eye on the ball. We also will all have the eye on a soccer ball in the big match this week in the World Cup finals between Argentina and Spain. This was the North American World Cup, and I wonder if you view it as an opportunity that was seized for greater North American cooperation or an opportunity that wasn't able to be taken advantage of due to some of these issues and tensions we've been discussing.
It's not only that I saw it or that I perceived that. I actually saw it in execution. I was able to go to the International Police Cooperation Center very close from here, and you could see police forces from every country in the world, and specifically Canada, Mexico, working together. The results are there, not only in that we didn't have any incident, that everything went smoothly, but also the level of attendance, and that's very exciting because it's a very popular sport. It's very exciting to see that it's taking some track in this country, and at the end, I think it's going to end up being the best World Cup we'll ever had.
Our thanks to the Mexican ambassador to the U.S., Roberto Lazzeri, joining us on Bloomberg. Now, from the battle between Spain and Argentina on the pitch to the battle between the U.S. and China on artificial intelligence and fears of another DeepSeek moment. Chinese AI startup Moonshot released a new model today dubbed Kimi K3, which it says rivals some of the leading offerings from OpenAI and Anthropic, a surprise breakthrough that sent stock markets reeling globally. Also breaking tonight, a Bloomberg scoop that the Trump administration is considering plans for an independent Finra-Like regulator to vet the safety of AI models. And here to help us break it down is Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. So, Mike, in some ways, these are connected stories because the U.S. has been trying to figure out how it can regulate artificial intelligence without holding back U.S. labs and meaning that they lose ground to China. Is a new regulator the answer?
Well, very much so in this. It is being driven by this sense of competition with China. And the degree to which they are feeling this sense of urgency is driven in part by what they see as rivalry in this space. And they don't necessarily want to just go completely hands off because there is a counter to this as well. And we hear that from Wall Street. We heard from Jamie Dimon and from Brian Moynihan this week warning about the perils of models like Anthropic's Mythos, which have such powerful cyber capabilities that if in the wrong hands, deployed against financial institutions, they could wreak systemic havoc. So Wall Street would like to see a little bit more hands-on approach. Silicon Valley certainly wants a less hands-on approach. And more than anything else, both both sides want a less ad hoc approach, which is what they felt they saw last month with the crackdown on Anthropic's and also OpenAI's latest models.
Well, so talk to us about Kimi. Sounds so benign with a name like that. This is from Moonshot AI. This is being framed as another DeepSeek moment. Shep, we talked about DeepSeek when it happened. It's said to be more capable than Anthropic's Fable 5, OpenAI's ChatGPT 5.6, at least in terms of front-end coding tests. Is this stolen technology? How'd they do it?
That is one of the debates out there right now. And certainly companies in Silicon Valley like Anthropic and OpenAI have made open and public claims that, yes, Chinese startups and Chinese AI labs have been using a practice known as distillation to extract results by the millions from their models to build a rival generation of chatbots. And, you know, we haven't drawn the line exactly to Moonshot yet, but they certainly have pointed the finger at Alibaba's Qwen model. They've pointed it at DeepSeek. They've pointed it at Minimax and some of the other Chinese ventures in this space. So it will be a matter of time before we perhaps hear about Moonshot. The underlying risk, Joe, is that the American labs and hyperscalers are spending hundreds of billions of dollars. And just this year alone, many of them plan to spend $700 billion on AI infrastructure. But if all of that is going to ultimately subsidize a generation of rivals in China produced on the cheap, that will undercut their business model. And that is really the economic risk. And it's one that former White House advisor David Sachs highlighted on a post on X earlier today.
Do we know how David Sachs feels about the new Finra-Like independent regulator idea?
Well, it's unclear whether he's hot or cold or lukewarm. He really is not in favor of like a heavy-handed government testing approach, but there may be something for him to like in that the industry would have strong input, at least under the plan that is taking shape. We don't have too many details of it, but it's being pushed by Scott Bessent, and it would really align with the way the brokerage industry is overseen by FINRA. It's industry funded, it's independent, it derives its authority from the SEC, but it is not exactly, you know, that kind of agency that, you know, sets limits and guardrails and rules in the way that some of the others that we would think of, for instance, in this case, when it comes to tech, commerce, or the FTC or something like that. So he may find something to like. And if nothing else, the industry certainly does. We do see that Google DeepMind founder Demis Hassabis, a Nobel Prize winner for his work, has embraced a very similar idea that he published earlier this week. And guess what? He is coming to town next week to talk about the plan, and there may be a convergence of the minds. And speaking of that, too, Sam Altman and Elon Musk, who are very rarely seen in the same sentence agreeing on anything, seem to both get behind this idea, too.
Pretty remarkable. I guess they can agree on something. Shep, another big day. Thanks for bringing it to us. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard with us in Washington. A Canadian haze descends onto D.C. How the president is reacting and where those dangerous air conditions may go from here. Now, stand by. Kaylee is about to go out in this. I'm staying inside. Grab your mask. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. President Trump flew from Washington to New York today through skies thick with smoke from Canadian wildfires. And on the flight, he took to Truth Social to declare that he is holding Canada accountable for what he calls, quote, willful negligence of forest maintenance, saying that tariffs Canada is currently paying should have the added costs of pollution, which he describes as filthy and unhealthy air that has come all the way down to D.C.
The smoke has come in from Canada, and it is scary, yes, particularly for younger people and older people.
That's Senator Shelley Moore Capito, the chair of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, speaking to us on Balance of Power this week about the smoke from Canadian wildfires that is blanketing millions across the United States and putting much of the Mid-Atlantic on air quality alerts. It was so thick in New York City on Thursday, you could barely see the Statue of Liberty. And now it's come here to D.C. obscuring the Washington Monument and the dome of the Capitol building that usually is visible right behind me, bringing the issue directly to lawmakers.
We are trying to get to a point where bipartisan we can do much more forest management, controlled burns, to be able to manage the forest to prevent these large and devastating forest fires. Obviously, it's a health issue, but we do have, I think, a will with Senator Curtis and Senator Kelly to be able to remedy this situation on a national basis.
Another senator, Republican Bernie Moreno of Ohio, is taking a different angle. He's planning to introduce a bill that would allow for the sanctioning of Canada and Canadian officials over the wildfires if the president determines they harmed U.S. air quality. But it's not just Canada where the fires are burning. There's more than a dozen of them in northern Minnesota. And scientists say the likelihood of more intense wildfires across North America is increasing due to the hotter weather and drier conditions from climate change. And joining us now for more is our political panel, Bloomberg politics contributors Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Democratic strategist and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, and Republican strategist Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. Both of you, of course, joining us from home. We did not force you to venture into the studio, given the air quality conditions we're experiencing from New York to D.C. Rick, is Canada going to have to pay more tariffs because of a natural disaster?
You know, I don't know if they're going to wind up paying more tariffs, but I would hate to be sitting across from that negotiating table while they're working on a replacement for the president's trade deal with Mexico and Canada. I mean, it's just the worst timing. And look, I mean, there is a cost to this kind of event, and it's not that necessarily these things can be avoided, but they can be managed, and I think that's what Senator Shelley Moore Capito was saying is, like, we have this debate in our country about proper forest management, and we need to come to grips with it, because these things, because we are in a drier, hotter environment in places like Canada, they're only going to get worse, not better. And we can survive this week, but we don't want this to become a permanent condition.
But wait a minute, Jeannie. Kayleigh said this is in Minnesota as well. Are we going to tariff Governor Tim Walz as part of this?
I think probably the president would like nothing more than to tariff Tim Walz. I think disturbing about this story, and of course, when this happened in New York, and now you guys have it in D.C., everybody here said, oh, my goodness, again, because we just went through this last year, and it seems like every summer now we go through this. But of course, this is a result of climate change. And I think what's so disturbing about the conversation and people like Bernie Moreno is their failure to think about, talk about, admit that that is what's going on here, and get on board with a plan to address that before it's too late for the entire world. I mean, so this is going to happen. It's going to happen more. It's happening around the world, and we have to get in front of it. And this administration has not done that. In fact, it's gone in the opposite direction.
Well, President Trump obviously took to Truth Social to talk about this today. He takes to Truth Social to talk about a lot of things, Rick, and apparently the company behind Truth Social wants to start charging to have faster access to what they're calling the platform's highest ranking accounts. Essentially, you have to pay for real-time access to the president's Truth Social feed. The Financial Times reported this could cost as much as $100,000 a month. You could get a lot of Bloomberg terminals for that kind of money. Rick, is this just a good business decision or brazen abuse of an office?
It reminds me of that movie Trading Places, where they're trying to get the, pork belly and corn and the orange juice numbers from the ag department a little bit before everybody else. And so what are we going to do? We're just going to sort of rationalize around insider trading. I mean, could you imagine? I'm gonna get a little heads up on what the president's doing that can move markets, which is the pitch. And if all I got to do is pay $1 million a year, hey, sounds like a good idea if I'm a high-speed trader or somebody like that. But this is a classic example of taking the public's information. Donald Trump is hired by the people of America not to make money, but to manage our country and do it for the people of our country, not for Wall Street. I love Wall Street, but I don't think they should learn ahead of everybody else what's going to happen in the world today.
I don't know if he's investing in frozen orange juice futures or not here, Jeannie, but we should remind everyone that what used to be considered the official business of the White House, issuing statements about any number of things, readouts from bilateral meetings, the president's own words, that is coming out on Truth Social now. That's what they're actually monetizing, is the word from the people's house. Can you make people pay for that?
President Trump is going to try. And I think one of the sort of difficult things to wrap our heads around is the fact that this is entirely legal. It is standard industry practice for platforms, but most platforms are not owned, to your point and Rick's point, by the President of the United States. And we have for a long time in this country trusted that presidents would do the right thing. They would treat the office with respect and be ethical. They would not continue to share ownership and to monetize off the office while they were in it. But this president has taken this to a whole new level. And so, from a perspective of the company, I understand it. They're losing a lot of money. But the president should have divested himself from this company. He and his family should not be monetizing on the office. And this is just part and parcel of what has been, just enormous pieces of corruption in this White House, and a president selling everything from booze to Bibles, cryptocurrency. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's hard to keep track of. And so we really need ethical reforms for this office.
Well, as we're having a conversation about the president's media platform and Truth Social, he also took to it this afternoon, Rick, to endorse Lindsey Graham's sister, Darline Graham, who, of course, is now serving in the United States Senate as caretaker, endorse her to run for the seat on a permanent basis to compete in the primary on August 11th. Does that make that primary process easier or more difficult?
It would actually probably clear the field. I'd hate to put her in this difficult position. They haven't even had a funeral ceremony for Lindsey Graham that's scheduled for week after next. And the reality is, putting her in the middle of all that, I don't think we're doing the family any benefit for that. It'd be great for the Republican Party. It'd be nice to have a Graham continue to serve in that seat. And the overwhelming positive feeling that the state has for the Graham family would extend to her. I am highly confident of that. That being said, plenty of good candidates already running in that primary. And I'd hate to put that kind of pressure on Darline. Yeah, Senator Graham.
I appreciate that answer, Rick. We did learn today, by the way, that Lindsey Graham's memorial dates have been set for July 28th and 29th in Washington, D.C. and in South Carolina. Could she be the next senator from South Carolina, Jeannie?
She absolutely could. I mean, I think, as usual, President Trump really shocked everybody by making this announcement. Certainly the governor never expected that she was going to be more than a seat warmer. And when President Trump said, "Run, Darline, run," we got indications from her camp that she is open to that. So I think she could run and win. There's going to be issues about what money she can take from his campaign. Rick can say this better than I can. I think they can't give more than $2,000, but certainly the NRCC can, spend almost unlimited amounts. So I think she would have a very good shot. And President Trump is probably looking at these other candidates and saying, we need a formidable candidate to keep this a Republican seat.
This midterm cycle continues to evolve before our eyes. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, thank you both. Have a great weekend. Avoid the smoke, and we'll meet you back here on Monday alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.